Welcome back to Animal Quests. Today we're diving into terrifying shark attacks that could have been avoided if the warnings had been heeded. From a videographer who waded into a baited harbor just to film a tiger shark up close, to a photographer who stepped into a murky lagoon at feeding time, despite everything the locals told her. Let's start with the first story, where a travel influencer chasing the perfect clip waded into shark-filled water that everyone around her was leaving. It was September 14th, 2015, along a quiet stretch of Central Florida coastline south of the main tourist beaches, where the afternoon air sat warm and heavy over the water. The day had been bright, but hours of strong wave action had churned the shallows into a clouded brown haze, and dense schools of mullet kept breathing the surface as they pushed parallel to the sand. Zinnia Vale, 24, was a travel and outdoor lifestyle influencer who had spent several years building an audience through beach photography and destination videos. By that year, she had gathered roughly 40,000 followers, enough to turn content creation into her main source of income. People who knew her described her as competitive and hardworking, the kind of person who watched closely which posts performed and which ones did not. I think that detail is important. When standing out is how you make money, it's easy to convince yourself to take one more risk. That summer, her engagement had been slipping, and the travel content space had grown crowded. She was collecting material for a new series on Florida's beaches and wildlife when she reached this stretch of shore. In the days before her visit, migrating mullet had pulled predators close to the beach, and a posted advisory near the access path urged swimmers to use caution during heavy baitfish activity. A lifeguard had also mentioned that conditions were poor and that the water was getting risky. She saw the warning and went in anyway. To me, that's the moment this stopped being bad luck and became a choice. Carrying a waterproof camera, she moved out between knee and waist depth and began filming the schools as they passed along the beach. For the first few minutes, nothing happened. As she stood there, several surfers paddling back to shore told her they were leaving because sharks had been actively chasing the baitfish nearby. She stayed in the water anyway. Other witnesses later recalled the bait repeatedly scattering around her, which is one of the clearest signs that a predator is working an area. Bull sharks are among the most dangerous sharks in shallow, murky water. They tolerate low salinity, patrol close to shore, and hunt aggressively when visibility is poor, striking fast at sudden movement and at the dense bait they follow into knee-deep water. In conditions exactly like that afternoon, a swimmer standing inside a feeding zone faces sharply increased risk. What makes bull sharks especially difficult to spot is that the water they prefer often hides them completely. Heavy rain, stirred-up sand, river outflow, and schools of baitfish can turn the shallows into a place where neither predator nor swimmer can see very far. The strike came as a sudden eruption of water. Witnesses caught only a brief glimpse of a large shark before it disappeared beneath the surface, the entire contact lasting a matter of seconds. The bite tore into Zinnia's upper thigh, severing the femoral artery and removing a large section of tissue, which triggered catastrophic blood loss almost at once. Nearby surfers reacted instantly, paddling to her and supporting her above the surface while shouting for the lifeguards. She remained responsive for a short time, but her condition fell quickly as the bleeding continued. Lifeguards reached her within minutes and brought her to shore, where emergency crews worked to control the hemorrhage before transporting her to a nearby trauma center. Despite aggressive treatment and emergency surgery, she died later that evening. Because she had an online following, news of her death spread through local outlets and online communities, though it stayed mostly regional. Investigators found no evidence of unusual shark behavior. Marine specialists believed a bull shark was the most likely species involved based on the location, the water conditions, and the wound characteristics, though no one could confirm it with certainty. They concluded the attack came from several known risk factors stacking together: murky water, dense baitfish, active predators, and a swimmer who stayed despite repeated warnings. Friends remembered her as ambitious and passionate, someone who sometimes accepted risks that felt manageable in the moment. Her waterproof camera was recovered from the shallows by responders, but authorities never released the recording publicly, both out of respect for her family and because the footage was considered too graphic to share. Looking back, I think this one was avoidable. Zinnia did not wade in planning to take a major risk. She waded in believing she was capturing something unique, and she stayed even after surfers told her to her face that sharks were hunting right where she was standing. That is exactly how a chain of ignored warnings turns into something irreversible. Zinnia trusted that calm-looking water meant safe water, but the next story shows that even a quiet, remote harbor can hide something just as patient and far more deliberate. It was September 8, 2018, at a small working harbor on the eastern side of Maui, Hawaii, used mainly by local fishing boats, where the late-day sun dropped low and the water near the docks had turned a dull, greasy gray. The air smelled of salt and fish, and a slick of blood and scraps drifted out from where the boats had spent the afternoon cleaning their catch. Zephyr Quillen, 34, was a freelance videographer who had recently shifted toward adventure content for social media. He was comfortable in the ocean and had logged plenty of hours filming surf and coastline, but he had almost no real experience around large predatory sharks. What drove him, by most accounts, was the constant search for footage that looked more dangerous than what other creators were posting. That detail explains a lot. When looking fearless becomes the goal, reckless decisions often follow. While working in Hawaii, Zephyr heard about this harbor from people who described it as a place where fishermen gutted and cleaned large fish at the end of every day, then dumped the scraps into the surrounding water. The workers there regularly reported tiger sharks drifting in to investigate, drawn by the steady supply of remains. Faded warning signs near the docks discouraged anyone from swimming in the area. To Zephyr, that reputation did not read as a warning. It read as a guarantee. The one place where he could film a large shark up close without chartering a boat or paying for a guided dive. He arrived late in the afternoon, after several boats had already cleaned their catch and the water was thick with scent and floating scraps. Harbor workers told him plainly that sharks were often pulled in by the smell of fish remains and that getting in the water was a bad idea. One of the dock workers stepped in front of him and told him directly that he was not allowed in the water and that the area was off limits to swimmers. Zephyr waited until the man moved on to other work, then quietly dropped in from the far side of the dock, staying near the pilings where the scraps were heaviest. That decision changed everything. He didn't accidentally find danger. He went right into it, despite the warnings, and passed an attempt to physically stop him. Tiger sharks are among the largest and most dangerous predators in Hawaiian waters, capable of reaching lengths well over 12 feet and weighing hundreds of pounds. Unlike many other shark species, they are opportunistic hunters that investigate a wide range of potential prey, relying on patience and close inspection before committing to an attack. In clear water, they are often seen long before they become a threat. In murky conditions, a swimmer may not see them at all until they are already within striking distance. When a large tiger shark drifted in and began circling, Zephyr kept recording instead of climbing out. The animal made a slow first pass, then a second, tightening its loop with each turn. That circling behavior is one of the clearest warning signs a large shark can give, an indication that it is assessing something in the water rather than simply passing through. The strike, when it came, was not a quick bite and release. The shark came up from below and clamped onto his upper thigh and hip, causing catastrophic blood loss as it dragged him beneath the surface, and the sheer size of the animal made any resistance meaningless. A mature tiger shark can generate tremendous bite force, and injuries to the upper leg are especially dangerous because of the major blood vessels that run through the area. In deep water, with no immediate help and no way to control the bleeding, even a survivable bite can become fatal within minutes. By the time the people on shore understood what was happening, the encounter was already over. Emergency services were contacted immediately, and a Coast Guard vessel was on scene within the hour. What followed was a prolonged search that extended into the following days. Remains and personal effects were eventually recovered in the area, though not intact, which is consistent with how these incidents typically resolve, and which made formal identification a slow process. The attack itself lasted well under a minute. His action camera was never recovered. In the aftermath, local officials cited the harbor as a clear example of why swimming near fish cleaning operations is so dangerous, and the warning signs were reinforced. Beyond that, little changed, because the people who worked there had understood the risk all along. Looking back, this one is hard to call anything other than self-inflicted. Zephyr was warned by the very people who knew the water best. He saw the scraps and the scent slick for himself, and he chose to stay in for a shot. He did not misjudge a calm-looking sea. He deliberately entered a feeding ground. Zephyr believed proximity to danger was the same as control over it, but the next story shows that even cold, open water far from any dock can turn just as deadly when a hunter is already watching from below. It was May 27th, 2014, along a fog-shrouded stretch of the central California coast, where the morning sat cold and gray, and the horizon had all but disappeared into the mist. The water was a flat, steely color, the swell rolling in slow and heavy, and the beach behind it was nearly empty, the parking area holding only a handful of cars at that early hour. Bryson Hale, 31, was a software engineer who spent nearly every weekend in the water. He had been surfing for years and considered himself experienced, the kind kind of surfer who knew the breaks, read the swell, and rarely let conditions change his plans. Friends knew him as someone who tended to dismiss the safety concerns other surfers raised, treating warnings as the nervous talk of people less comfortable in the ocean than he was. To me, that's what this whole story comes down to. Confidence helped him in the water until it made him ignore the warning that mattered most. For several weeks before that morning, large numbers of seals had been hauling out and gathering near the section of coastline Bryson liked best. Their presence had not gone unnoticed. Several shark sightings had been reported by surfers, fishermen, and lifeguards over the previous weeks, and word had spread through the local surf community. Many regulars had quietly started avoiding the spot altogether, choosing breaks farther up or down the coast until the seals thinned out and the sharks moved on. Bryson knew all of this. He had heard the reports, he had seen the seals himself, and he had been told directly by other surfers that they were staying away. He went out anyway, which is the point, in my opinion, where this stopped being an unlucky encounter and started being a decision. That foggy morning, with the visibility poor and almost no one else in the water, he paddled out and then kept going. A few surfers had initially gone out at dawn, but had already left after seeing seals gathering unusually close to the lineup. Bryson pushed farther offshore than usual in search of the larger, cleaner waves forming beyond the main break. The combination worked against him at every level. Low visibility meant he could not see what was beneath or around him. The heavy seal activity meant the water was already attracting predators, and his position out past everyone else placed him alone, on the edge of a known hunting zone, in exactly the kind of setting where these animals feed. Great white sharks are among the most powerful predators in the ocean, capable of reaching lengths well over 15 feet and weighing more than 2,000 pounds. Along the central California coast, they feed heavily on seals and sea lions, and they hunt using a signature ambush strategy, holding deep below their target and then rushing upward in a single explosive strike. From the surface, a surfer lying flat on a board, arms and legs dangling, presents a silhouette unsettlingly similar to a seal, especially in murky, low-light water. Where the seals gather, the great whites follow, and the conditions that morning checked every box. The attack came from directly beneath him. Several people on shore later reported seeing a sudden explosion of white water around him, a single violent ambush that seemed to come out of nowhere. There was almost no warning. Witnesses saw only a brief disturbance before he disappeared from view, and by the time other surfers and rescuers could reach the area, his injuries were unsurvivable. The strike, delivered by an animal of that size moving at full speed, had caused catastrophic damage, and there was nothing anyone in the water could meaningfully do. He did not survive. Recovery and response took place over the hours that followed, and the beach was closed while authorities assessed the area. Wildlife experts who reviewed the circumstances later said the incident was consistent with known great white hunting behavior, low visibility, heavy seal activity, a lone surfer positioned beyond the group, and an ambush strike from below. The story drew local and regional coverage for a few days, the kind that briefly reopens the conversation about sharks before quietly fading. Among the surfers who knew the spot, it confirmed what they had already feared, and most of them stayed away from that break for the rest of the season. Looking back, this one is difficult to file under bad luck. Bryson did not wander into an unknown risk. He paddled into a spot he had been specifically warned about, on a morning when the conditions could hardly have been worse, and he pushed himself farther out than anyone else. He trusted his own experience over every signal telling him to stay in. Bryson believed that knowing the water made him safe in it, but the next story shows that even a guided trip with professionals on board offers no protection when someone decides the rules are not meant for them. It was November 14th, 2021, far offshore in the deep blue water of the Bahamas, miles from the nearest land, where the surface stretched out flat and endless under a bright afternoon sun. The water here ran thousands of feet deep, a rich electric blue with no bottom in sight, the kind of open ocean that looks calm and inviting right up until you remember what moves through it. Sorelve, 29, was a travel influencer who specialized in extreme adventure content. She had built her audience on footage that looked more daring than what other creators were posting, the kind of clips that made followers stop scrolling, and she was always chasing the next one. Crew members and guides who worked with people like her often described her as someone who disliked following restrictions, who treated safety rules as obstacles between her and the shot she wanted. That is the core of what happened here, because in most environments a person can bend the rules and get away with it, but the open ocean does not grade on a curve. That day, Sorel had joined a small offshore shark diving charter operating far from land, the kind run by independent operators who take experienced divers out to controlled, baited encounters. Before the boat ever left the dock, the crew gave a detailed safety briefing. They were specific about it. Nobody was permitted to enter the water outside the supervised sessions, because oceanic whitetips were regularly encountered in the area during offshore dives, and these were not animals to be in the water with casually or alone. The rules existed for one reason: to keep every diver within sight and within reach of the crew at all times. Sorel listened to the briefing along with everyone else, and then, when it mattered, She ignored it. The supervised dive went as planned. Afterward, the passengers climbed back aboard and began the ordinary work of storing gear and rinsing equipment. The dive master had gone below briefly to help a passenger with a stuck wetsuit zipper, while the deckhands were occupied rinsing tanks on the far side of the vessel. It was a narrow window, less than 3 minutes by later estimates, but it was enough. Sorrel slipped over the side on the opposite end of the boat. Quietly, without her fins, carrying only her action camera on a floating rig. She wanted footage of herself alone in the open ocean, suspended over thousands of feet of blue with no guides and no other divers in the frame. The deckhand spotted her almost immediately, maybe 90 seconds after she entered the water, and shouted for the dive master. By then, she had drifted perhaps 20 feet from the hull, not far in distance, but far enough that the current was already working against her. The dive master surfaced topside within seconds and began calling to her to return to the boat. What happened in the next several minutes is where accounts differ slightly, but the broad sequence is consistent across crew testimony. She was swimming back toward the vessel, or attempting to, when the shark arrived. Oceanic white-tip sharks are among the most dangerous open ocean predators in the world, reaching lengths of around 10 to 13 feet and built for a habitat where food is scarce and widely scattered. Unlike reef sharks, they live in the open blue where meals are rare, which makes them bold, persistent, and methodical investigators of anything that might be edible. They are known for approaching slowly, then circling and bumping a target, testing it, and they do not spook easily once they have committed their attention. They are also the sharks most often linked to attacks on isolated people far from shore. In deep offshore water, a lone person at the surface, moving and splashing, is exactly the kind of curiosity these sharks are wired to pursue. The baited dive earlier in the afternoon had already drawn at least one into the area and kept it close. The crew threw a flotation ring, and the dive master entered the water immediately to assist her. The shark had already made contact by the time he reached her. He managed to get between the animal and sorrel and got her to the swim platform, but the initial injury was severe. The crew had emergency oxygen and a trauma kit aboard, standard equipment on reputable charters, and they used both while pushing the vessel to full throttle toward shore. The Coast Guard was reached by radio within minutes. None of it was enough. She died before any additional medical help could reach her. Looking back, this one falls almost entirely on a choice. Sorrel was not failed by her crew or surprised by unusual animal behavior. She deliberately slipped into open ocean alone, against an explicit briefing. In water everyone on that boat knew held oceanic whitetips. She wanted an image of herself, isolated in the blue, and the ocean gave her exactly that. Sorrel believed the rules were there for less capable people, but the next story shows that even years of hard-earned experience offer no protection when a person carries the wrong thing into the water with them. It was January 22nd, 2022, along a rugged stretch of the South African coast, where the summer sun sat high over water that shifted between deep green and dark blue. The swell was moderate, the visibility decent near the surface, but fading into murk farther down, and the rocky shoreline behind him was empty, the nearest help a long way off. It was the kind of remote, productive spot that serious spearfishers seek out precisely because so few other people bother to reach it. Trevor Mattis, 41, was a construction supervisor and a dedicated recreational spearfisher. He had years of experience in the water and a deep confidence in his own ability, the sort built over countless dives that had gone exactly the way he expected. That confidence had a flip side, though. He tended to view safety recommendations as overcautious, the kind of advice meant for less experienced divers, and friends often joked that Trevor believed experience made him immune to mistakes. That's what stands out to me. Past success gave him confidence, but the habit he refused to change cost him his life. Trevor regularly traveled to coastal areas known for productive spearfishing, and this stretch of South African coast was among the richest, holding good numbers of fish, and, just as importantly, sitting squarely within waters where great white sharks are known to patrol. Experienced divers had warned him about this more than once. The specific concern was always the same, that staying in the water too long after a catch and carrying bleeding fish attached to his body was an invitation in a region full of large predators. Most serious spearfishers there towed their catch well behind them on a separate float line for exactly that reason. Trevor preferred clipping his fish directly to his belt instead, keeping them close and within easy reach. He had heard the warnings repeatedly. He simply did not change the way he dove, because nothing bad had ever happened before, and to him, that was proof enough that nothing would. That day, diving solo, Trevor had a productive session and successfully speared several large fish. The reasonable move, the one every warning had pointed toward, was to bring his catch in and get out of the water. Instead, he clipped the speared fish to the belt at his waist and kept hunting, the bleeding bodies trailing against him as he moved. Each fish leaked blood and fluids into the water, and each one twitched and struggled, sending out exactly the kind of vibrations and scent trail that travel a long way through the ocean. He had effectively turned himself into a source of everything a large predator hunts by, and he stayed out there, alone, long after he should have been back on the rocks. Great white sharks are among the largest predatory fish in the ocean, reaching lengths well over 15 feet and weights beyond 2,000 pounds, and the waters off South Africa hold one of the most concentrated populations on the planet. They possess an extraordinary sense for detecting blood, vibration, and the erratic movements of injured prey, often from considerable distances. A great white does not typically hunt people. It hunts seals, sea lions, and fish, and it tracks them by exactly the kind of disturbance a wounded fish gives off. A diver carrying a string of bleeding, struggling catch against his body, in practical terms, broadcasting the signal of injured prey. The danger was never that the shark wanted Trevor. The danger was that Trevor had attached himself to what the shark wanted. A great white drawn in by the struggling, bleeding fish closed in fast and struck at the catch clipped to his waist. There was little warning in open water like that, just the sudden arrival of an enormous animal homing in on the scent trail he had been dragging behind him. The shark was almost certainly targeting the fish rather than the man, but with the catch fixed to his belt, there was no separating the two. The bite tore through the fish and into his hip and upper thigh, severing the femoral artery and causing catastrophic blood loss in seconds. Alone in deep water, with no one nearby to pull him out or slow the bleeding, he had no chance. And the dive that should have ended 20 minutes earlier ended in the worst possible way. Other divers later found his abandoned float, a damaged belt rig, and blood in the water along that section of coast, and alerted authorities once it was clear he was missing. A recovery effort followed. Marine experts who reviewed what happened pointed to a combination of avoidable choices rather than any unusual aggression from the animal: the solo diving, the bleeding catch clipped to his body, and the decision to stay in the water far longer than he needed to. The shark, they noted, had behaved exactly as a great white in those waters would be expected to behave, striking at what looked and smelled like wounded prey. The incident drew brief regional coverage and circulated through the local spearfishing community, where it became a sobering reminder that the warnings everyone had repeated to Trevor were not theoretical. This one stands out because the danger was not hidden in the slightest. Trevor knew the waters held great whites. He had been warned specifically about carrying bleeding fish, and he chose to do it anyway, on a solo dive, well past the point of any sensible exit. He did not misjudge an unfamiliar risk. He repeated a familiar one until it finally caught up with him. Trevor believed his experience made him the exception, but the next story shows that even sticking close to shore in shallow water offers no guarantee when a determined predator decides to move in. It was July 19, 2016, along the murky shallows of a coastal lagoon system on Florida's Atlantic side, where the late-day light had turned the water a flat, tea-colored brown. The tide was shifting, the air thick and humid, and the channels that cut through the lagoon were alive with movement. Dense schools of baitfish flickering near the surface as the day cooled toward evening. It was the kind of place that looks peaceful at a glance and hides almost everything beneath it. Callie Voss, 27, was a social media photographer who spent most of her time documenting beaches, wildlife, and outdoor adventures across the state. She had built a modest following by posting close-up footage of animals and dramatic nature encounters, the kind of images that put viewers right in the middle of something most people only see from a safe distance. Friends described her as fearless, but they also admitted she had a habit of ignoring warnings whenever she thought a risk might produce something unique. That's the lesson here. Fearless and reckless can seem identical until the consequences show up. Callie had spent several days filming around the lagoon, a system already well known for its large population of bull sharks. Local fishermen talked about it openly, describing how the sharks gathered near the channels whenever the tide pushed schools of baitfish into tight, concentrated pockets. More than one person mentioned to her that getting into the water near actively feeding fish was a bad idea, that the lagoon was not the place to be waiting around at the wrong time of day. She listened, but she had grown more interested in capturing footage from inside the water rather than from the safety of the bank, and the warnings did not change that. Near sunset, with the light going golden and the baitfish stacking up in the channel, she waded into the murky, waist-deep water, carrying a waterproof camera. She stayed only 40 or 50 yards out from the bank, close enough to feel safe, far enough to be in the worst of it. The conditions could hardly have been worse. The water was clouded with sediment, visibility was almost nothing, and the dense schools moving through the channel were creating exactly the disturbance that draws predators in close. Fishermen nearby called out again, telling her the bull sharks hunted that stretch regularly. She believed the warnings were exaggerated, the kind of caution locals throw at outsiders, and she kept working to close the distance for the footage she wanted. Bull sharks are widely considered among the most dangerous sharks to humans, precisely because of where they choose to live. Unlike most large sharks, they thrive in shallow, brackish, low-visibility water, the murky lagoons, river mouths, and nearshore channels where people actually swim. They are stocky, powerful, and territorial, and they hunt aggressively in exactly the kind of clouded water where they rely on vibration and movement far more than sight. In a sediment-choked channel full of darting baitfish, any large moving object entering the feeding zone can trigger an aggressive feeding response, and a person standing in the middle of it is just one more source of movement in the dark. It happened fast. A large bull shark moving through the bait struck her with the kind of force that left no chance to react. The bite landed high on her upper thigh, severing the femoral artery and tearing through muscle before the shark vanished back into the murk. In water that clouded, she would never have seen it coming. Just the sudden impact and then the rush of everything going wrong at once. With an injury like that, severe blood loss began almost immediately. The fishermen who had warned her only minutes earlier rushed into the shallows and worked to drag her toward the bank, shouting for help as they went, but the bleeding was far beyond anything they could control on a muddy shoreline at sunset. Emergency responders arrived quickly, but the injuries were unsurvivable, and she died before anything more could be done. Investigators recovered her camera later during a search of the area, though authorities never publicly discussed what the device had recorded. In the aftermath, local officials renewed their warnings about entering bait-rich water during feeding periods, especially in lagoon systems known for large shark populations, though for the people who fished there, none of it was new information. Looking back, this one follows the same pattern as so many of these stories. Callie was not ambushed in unfamiliar territory. She was warned repeatedly by people who knew the water about the exact danger that killed her, and she waded in anyway for a closer shot. She did not believe the lagoon was as dangerous as the locals said, and that disbelief is what put her in the water at the worst possible moment.